This is Shelton cassette number 4, delivered by Dr. Herbert M. Shelton at Miami Beach, Florida on May the 7th, 1953.
Our next speaker, of course, needs no introduction. Everyone that ever introduces Dr. Shelton always uses those same words. However, I'm going to tell you something confidential. Everybody move in just a little closer. Did you notice he had one tooth missing? Well, I had the nerve to ask him what happened. And here's the truth, because Shelton only tells the truth. He says he got kicked in the teeth by a stallion. And he also added, only a horse has got strength enough to kick a tooth out of a hygienist. The subject that we have assigned to Dr. Shelton on this afternoon's lecture is epidemics in children. It's a very serious question, and one that we read about daily in the presses. And so without stealing his thunder, I'd like to call my good friend and yours, Dr. Herbert M. Shelton, San Antonio, Texas.
Thank you, Dave. Now that all of you have had your curiosity satisfied about those teeth of mine, and actually there's more than one tooth missing. There are 3 missing and 3 more to go. As a matter of fact, I have great difficulty in biting anything. I can chew, but biting is out of the question. And it is true that I don't know of anything short of a stallion that could have done it, but he did it. There are many things that we do not know. There are at least 2 or 3 things that I don't know. I believe that Dr. John Curcio admits that there's one thing that he doesn't know. I doubt that Dr. Kahn knows everything yet. And in relation to this subject of epidemics, there's much yet to be learned. I think there's much that we do know, but I think there's much yet that we'll learn, or our grandchildren will learn in the future. So I'm going to discuss with you this evening epidemics in children as far as our knowledge extends. In the first place, as I mentioned to you last night, I believe it was, in answering some of your questions, an epidemic is mass sickness. And mass sickness requires some general enervating or prostrating influence that brings down or prostrates whole groups of people at one time. I know that it is generally thought that epidemics are due to the fact that somebody develops a disease, nobody knows how. There's always that first case and nobody knows how it developed. And then the disease spreads from that center, from person to person, by some means. Usually it is assumed that the wind or the air or articles of clothing or something else carries germs from one person to another. You're advised, for instance, not to sneeze if you have a cold or a cough in the presence of others, because a cough sends germs for about 12 feet away from you, and anybody in front of you will breathe those germs. Well, he wouldn't have to. The germs that were supposed to be the cause of colds were already in his nose and throat before you sneezed. They're practically omnipresent. You live in an ocean of germs. You were born into a world that is literally reeking with them. They're in the air you breathe. They're in the water you drink. They're in the food you eat. They're on your hands. They're on everything that you come in contact with. And it is not possible for you to avoid them unless you were brought up under a glass cage with a Bunsen burner under your nose, and that glass cage sprayed with a solution of formaldehyde at all times. You would live all your life in contact with germs of all kinds. If these germs are the cause of our diseases, our so-called infectious diseases, then the whole population should be at all times in the throes of not one epidemic, but several. There should not be a time in the year when there aren't epidemics, not confined to Miami or to New York or to San Francisco, but worldwide, because they're here at all times. Now, to get around that, our medical friends and bacteriologists have invented a funny idea that germs lose their virulence at times and they regain it at other times. So when they lose during those periods when they have lost their virulence, well, you're safe. And when they regain their virulence by some kind of a process that nobody knows anything about, then they start an epidemic. Sometimes they vary that program a little bit, and they make it depend not upon the loss or gain of virulence on the part of the germ, but the loss or increase of resistance on the part of the individual. I don't think they're sure just which is which, whether it's the loss of virulence or the gain of virulence for the germs, or the loss of resistance or the gain of resistance on the part of the population. But anyhow, they can fall back on one or the other at any time they want to in explaining the origin of an epidemic or the failure of one of the threatened epidemics to develop. They like to threaten us every once in a while with an epidemic. A few years ago, for example, they told us that particular year was smallpox year. Well, we didn't have an epidemic of smallpox, and I don't recall seeing an explanation of why we didn't have it. I'd like to point out to you this evening that no man living, and no man who ever lived, could tell in advance when there was going to be an epidemic, nor what kind of an epidemic we were going to have. That's just scare propaganda. That is used by a profession that traffics in fear. They believe in frightening you, because only thus can they keep you making a track to their offices and taking their poisons, letting them remove your organs. At the same time, of course, they remove your purse. At least when they get through with you, you don't any longer have need for a purse. You're in somewhat the position I was in once when I was just a little boy. One of my neighbors wanted me to do some work for him. There's some little minor something, didn't amount to anything, so I did it, and he handed me a dime. Of course, that was in the days when a dime was a dime. Nowadays, it's not even half a cent. But so I had a dime, and I wondered what I was going to do with it. I went down to the nearby store, and I looked around, and I saw some pocketbooks. I said, gee, I've got to have a pocketbook to put this dime in. So I bought a pocketbook for a dime. I got the pocketbook, and then I suddenly realized I didn't have a dime to put in it. After you've been to the physician's office, you're not only minus your appendix, you're minus anything to go into the purse. Mass prostrating influences of various kinds further prostrate an already enervated population. Our mode of living in civilized life is such that we can hardly find a man or woman who is not at all times more or less enervated. Our overwork, and how we love to say we overwork. Actually, very few people overwork in the sense that they commonly use that term. And that doesn't mean that they're not all overworked. George Bernard Shaw once helped a group of anthropologists and various other technically trained men to investigate the living habits and the working habits of businessmen in London. And they investigated their smoking and their drinking and their eating and their dancing and their various social habits and their working habits and their sexual habits and so on. And when they got through and made their report, Shaw made the statement in reference to it that those men do 2 hours work a day and take 8 hours to do it in. Most of the people who complain that they're overworking are doing just that. They're doing 2 hours work a day You're taking 8 hours or 10 hours to do it in. How do I know? Because I watch it. Because on the other hand, I work 14 to 16 hours a day, and I rarely feel that I've overworked. Nonetheless, there are a few people who overwork in the conventional sense of that expression. But most of them overwork themselves by their gluttony, by their poison habits, so-called stimulant habits, their coffee habits, their tea habits, their cocoa and chocolate habits, their alcohol habits, their tobacco habits, their habit of taking constipation remedies, their habit of taking something to relieve the distress in their stomach after they have these wonderful meals that they love to eat. I wonder how many of you realize that millions of dollars a year are made out of the sale of Tums and Bel-Ans and other substances of that kind that people take regularly to relieve themselves of gastric distress. And they take it after each meal instead of learning a few simple rules of eating that would enable them to go through life without that discomfort. And those things not only cause you discomfort, they cause enervation. And then there's the habit of taking constipation cures. Trainload upon trainload of pills are sold in the country every year for constipation. And nobody has ever had their constipation remedied in all the ages of the world by taking such things. But they are enervating. And then there are the headache remedies. I don't know whether you do it here in Miami or not. I don't see much of it in San Antonio, but in New York City I used to see it quite often. I'd see a girl in the subway in the subway station waiting for a subway train. She'd walk over by one of the pillars there, and she'd open up her purse, and she'd reach in and she'd take out an aspirin and turn her back to the crowd and take an aspirin. Well, you can go along the highways of the country and go into the filling stations and the hot dog stands and various other places of that kind and buy aspirin. 3 of them put up in little cellophane bags. I believe they sell for $0.10. You get cheated if they give them to you in $0.10 to take them off their hand. But nonetheless, so prevalent is their use that they're sold everywhere, and they're innovative. These are just some of the habits that innovate our people. Among our children, the chief innovating habits are overexcitement, lack of sleep, overfeeding, and the drugging that is done. We'd often start our babies out as little toys and playthings. We just play with them, and we play with them, and we show them off, and we dress them up so don't they look dainty and cute? Now, don't tell me that cute means bow-legged. And we like to show them off when they ought to be asleep. And we wake them up to feed them. That's what you're told by the experts. That ought to be spelled EX-SPURTS. Experts. Wake them up and feed them at regular feeding times. That is not the proper way to feed a child, of course. Such feeding overfeeds, and overfeeding enervates, and overfeeding poisons. Our enervated children, I'm speaking of epidemics in children, are at all times just on the verge of illness, if they're not at all times ill. It's amazing how many times you can receive a letter from a family where there's a husband and a wife and as many as 4 or 5 children in the family. And in the letter, they'll say, little Mary has just had a cold, or she is suffering very severely with what the doctor calls the flu, or Johnny has pneumonia, or we've just had little Willie's tonsils removed. Every time you hear from such a family, there's somebody in the family that is sick. And they've all been vaccinated, and they've all been inoculated, and they've all been toxoided, And some of them are only little shells of what they should be. They've had so many organs removed. But every once in a while they're sick. So, watching these things, these developments and these conditions in children belonging to parents who go to child specialists and to their family physicians for advice, and who carry out the advice that they receive from these people in the care of their children, watching them over a number of years and seeing the results of carrying out such advice, I offer to the mothers of this country this advice about caring for their children. Go to the best child specialist you can find in your hometown, get all of the advice that he has to give, and then do exactly opposite to everything he advises. You'll be right more often than wrong if you do that. During the course of our talks here, Dr. Esser has explained to you, Dr. John Curcio has explained to you, and I have explained to you the development of toxemia. How toxemia results from impairment or checking of the normal processes of elimination of the body, of body waste. These wastes, when they're not fully eliminated, accumulate in the blood, in the lymph, and in the tissues of the body. I believe Dr. Anderson stressed this too last night in his talk. This results from innervation, and innervation results from many things. When a child is innervated, it becomes toxemic. But more than that, when it is innervated, not only is excretion or elimination checked, but secretion is also impaired, so that digestion is impaired. And then, with an impaired digestion and the common overfeeding of children, there is fermentation and putrefaction of food in the digestive tract, resulting in the production of a whole series of poisons, a part of which are absorbed into the bloodstream to be added to the toxemia that results from the accumulation of retained cell waste. This is a superadded cause that constitutes a complication of toxemia. Epidemics of colds, such things as you call influenza, which is just a bad cold, a little more severe than the rest of them. Epidemics of catarrhal conditions grow largely out of starch and sugar excesses, superadded to innervation and toxemia. The epidemics of the other types of diseases, pneumonia, smallpox, diphtheria, scarlet fever, measles, chickenpox, diseases of that type, result from protein poisoning superadded to toxemia. Now I say superadded to toxemia because if your child is not innervated and toxemic, the overeating of proteins at Thanksgiving or at Christmas may produce a little discomfort, but it will not produce any serious trouble. But if the child is already innervated and toxemic, then the superaddition of this additional poison of a highly toxic character to the toxemia results in the necessity for the immediate development of a process of vicarious or compensatory elimination. Now, the two chief channels through which the body eliminates toxins, I mean vicariously now, are the mucous membranes, which is the internal skin, and the skin on the outside of the body. Largely through the internal skin in the form of a catarrhal secretion or excretion, and through the external skin in the form of skin eruptions, as you see in measles, scarlet fever, and so forth. Watch your newspapers for the development of epidemics in children and see how closely they follow upon the heels of feast days, Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, and other feast days of the year, when the children are stuffed literally stuffed until the food runs out their ears on turkey and chicken and other flesh foods, combined so haphazardly and indiscriminately that not a digestive system known to man. I don't mean just the human digestive system. I mean the digestive systems of the whole animal kingdom could digest such a meal. Putrefaction is inevitable. And that means poisoning of a very septic character. Septic poisoning, which must be gotten rid of through some vicarious channel due to the fact that the organs of elimination are impaired. And even before the meal was taken, we're unable to keep the bloodstream sweet and clean at all times. More than once in my life, I have gone through Christmas and Thanksgiving when other people were glutting themselves. Fasting. It always seemed rather strange to me, ever since I was a little shaver, began to think about such things. It seemed rather strange to me that people would celebrate the birth of their Savior by getting drunk, making a loud noise, and making a pig of themselves. But that's the accepted way of celebrating it. We give the children not only these Thanksgiving dinners and Christmas dinners, but we follow it with a lot of candy, or accompany it with a lot of candy. Cranberry sauce, and other things of that kind that guarantee indigestion. And what is indigestion? It's putrefaction and fermentation of food in the digestive tract. Nothing more, nothing less. That's indigestion. And it means poisoning. Poisoning from without. Nothing is in the body that has not passed through either the internal skin or the external skin and gotten into the bloodstream or into the tissues beneath, or between rather, those two skins or those two membranes. So that poisoning that is derived from the digestive tract is poisoning from without, or exogenous poisoning as we term it in technical terms. We like to use those $15 words because it makes you think we know more than we do. Nothing like having a technical jargon that the common man doesn't understand. You can hide your ignorance behind it. If you can use $25 words, that's still better. To avoid epidemics in your children of all kinds, don't worry about the fact that the child next door has measles or scarlet fever, and you've got to keep your child in the house lest it gets scarlet fever or measles. I remember once, and I got arrested for this. I got a letter. This is while I was on the staff of the New York Evening Graphic. Some of you people here who are from New York may have been readers of my articles in the Graphic years ago. Let me see the hands of those who were. There's one there. Yeah, there are several of my old readers here. I received a letter from a lady up in the Bronx. She says there are several cases of scarlet fever in my neighborhood. Shall I have my children inoculated, or shall I take them away from this neighborhood until the epidemic ends? So I wrote her a letter and I said, don't have your children inoculated and don't run away from the neighborhood. If your children are ripe for the development of scarlet fever, they'll develop it without coming in contact with another case. That's the way the first case developed. If they're not ripe for it, they won't develop the disease if there's another case in the same bed with them. And there have been thousands of cases like that. Well, I then took part of that letter and I incorporated it into an article for the Graphic. And it was published. A few days later, in the early morning, my bell rang, doorbell, and I went to the door, and I admitted a man, and he reached in his pocket and he pulled out his badge. He says, I'm an investigator from the Board of Health. I invited him into the office and offered him a chair. He reached in his other pocket and he brought out an article from the Graphic. It was this particular article. He said, you write this? I said, yes. Are you responsible for it? I said, yes. He says, you don't have to be, you know. You can make the Graphic responsible. I said, I wrote it. I'll accept the responsibility. He says, you know, the Board of Health don't agree with you. I said, I don't agree with the Board of Health. He says, they don't like for things like this to be written and published. I said, have we repealed the Constitution? Don't we longer have freedom of the press and freedom of speech in this country? Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes. Well, I said, I do not intend to take my articles down to the Board of Health and have them passed on by the Board of Health before they're published. Oh, you don't have to do that. Nonetheless, a few days later I was arrested. But when I came to trial, can you imagine that the gentleman who came and found out whether I was responsible for the article or not was in the courtroom with the article, and it was given to the court as evidence against me. I was practicing medicine without a license. I wouldn't practice medicine if I had a license. I want to tell you some more evidence they read against me in the court that day. I had a little book at the time, it's out of print now, entitled Living Life to Live It Longer. Now you can imagine in a book of that type that I must have told the people how to take drugs to live. Living life to live it longer. They read the last paragraph on the last page of the last chapter in the book. It says, let me reiterate, if the practice of medicine and all of its branches were destroyed, human life would increase by a decade in 10 years. And they actually read that statement into court to prove to the court that I was practicing medicine. And the judge says, why, he has a right to say that if he wants to. There's a lot of people in the country who believe that way. What they were trying to do was to show that I was guilty of medical heresy. They wanted to burn me at the stake or consign me to the fond embraces of the Iron Virgin or something of that kind. They wanted to get rid of me anyhow. They didn't. I'm still around and I'm still kicking. I expect to be here a long time yet. So far as shutting me up is concerned, old Uncle Sam himself tried that during World War I, and he discovered it was a rather difficult task. I was opposed to the war, and I went all through the war opposed to it. They took me into the army, and they got me in the army, and they threatened me with a court-martial to shut my mouth, and they couldn't do it. I'm just like a woman. I'm half woman anyhow. My mother was a woman. I just can't keep my tongue still when I have something to say. And so long as I have anything to say about this medical profession and its practices and its evils, I'm going to keep saying them. You stop a minute and ask yourself this question. We're going to take for granted that the story in the Bible about Adam and Eve is the correct history of the creation of man, and that mankind started with Adam and Eve. And sometime or other, a year or two after they were created, they got kicked out of the Garden of Eden because Eve's curiosity got the best of her, and she ate an apple. Now, I often wonder why God was so ashamed of apples. Nonetheless, sometime between Adam and Eve and you and me, somebody developed the first case of smallpox. He didn't catch it from a prior case. He didn't come in contact with somebody else who had smallpox. His was the first case. How did he develop it? If one person can develop smallpox without coming in contact with another case, why cannot millions of cases develop without the contact with another case? Now, as a matter of common logic, we have to accept the fact that like causes produce like effects. And when effects vary, it's because the object upon which that cause operates varies. If one man can develop smallpox out of a given set of pathogenic circumstances, another man can develop smallpox out of the same given set of pathogenic circumstances, and they may be one of them in China and the other in New York City, too far apart for one to catch it from the other. Out of 100 people in the same neighborhood, living more or less alike, in the same toxemic state, subjected to the same environment, to the same exhausting influences, with the same type of constitution, with the same tendencies or diatheses, develop trouble at the same time or thereabouts, there's nothing strange in it that they should have the same trouble. That is, that they should all have smallpox or typhoid or pneumonia or something of the kind. But I'd call your attention to this fact too, that if there's 100 cases of smallpox in your neighborhood, no two of them will be alike. One of them will be so mild that the patient won't go to bed, and the other will be so violent that the patient will be dead in 24 to 36 hours. One of them will be so mild that they'll just doubt whether it's smallpox. And the other may be so severe that they may be the hemorrhagic kind. They may think it's Black Death or bubonic plague or something of the kind. They're not alike. These diagnoses they make are more or less arbitrary things. You're just sick. You've got an eruption. You've got a high fever. But your eruption is somewhat different to the eruption your neighbor had, or even somebody else in the same house with you, or in the same family. And your fever isn't as high, or it's a little higher. And the other symptoms vary. Not something you caught from somebody else. So I'd like to emphasize that when your children become ill in the so-called epidemic, it's because you yourselves have been miscarrying for those children. Children's diseases are parents' mistakes. If you feed your child properly, if you see to it that that child gets plenty of rest and sleep, if you provide it with fresh air and with sunshine and with wholesome activity, if you do not drug it, if you do not let it enervate itself by overexcitement and too much play, you'll have a healthy child. I have seen children, hygienically reared, sit on the bedside of other children that were suffering with measles. And they didn't have measles subsequent thereto. I remember once the lady came into my office when I was in New York City, and I had my office and my home together. She brought in two little children, and she was sitting in the waiting room, and I was looking after somebody else, and one of the little children went down the hall into the living quarters. My youngest boy was a little baby in the crib at the time. And she missed her child, and she went to looking for it, and she found her child standing over the crib with my boy, little boy. She got all excited. When I let her into the office, she was in really a state of agitation. "What are we going to do, Dr. Shelton?" she says. "My child has scarlet fever, and it's just been down there at the bedside of your boy." I said, "Well, just forget about it. My boy isn't going to have scarlet fever." And it didn't. I remember a case, an incident of that kind that happened in San Antonio, a couple of years after I went to San Antonio. There was a lady across the street who had a little boy that was about the same age as my oldest boy. We had quite a bit of grounds at the health school, and she used to come over and bring her boy over, and she and my wife would sit in the front yard under the trees and let the two little boys play together and run and romp on the ground. One day we missed the little boy. The next day he was still missing. We didn't see the mother. 2 or 3 days passed. Then one morning the mother came running into the health school, and she was all excited. She wondered, "What are we going to do? Oh, what are we going to do?" And we didn't know what it was all about. She said, "My little boy has whooping cough, and your little boy came over in our yard and While I wasn't looking, my little boy got out of the house, and I found them out there playing together. I had a good laugh. I said, don't worry about it. Nothing happened. The boy didn't have whooping cough. I could stand here and enumerate cases like that all day. I wouldn't have to confine myself to members of my own family. I could enumerate case after case of that kind. I know some of you can tell me where somebody had a disease in the schoolroom and the whole schoolroom had it. How do you account for that? Well, I account for it on common causes producing common effects. And when the causes are missing, the effects have to be missing also. When the child is healthy, when the child is maintained in a state of health by first-class habits of living, that child need be afraid of no epidemic. Neither should the parents worry their heads over whether or not their child is going to catch something. The only thing it's likely to catch is a ball. Now, if you've been foolish enough to bring your child up in such a way that it has developed, not caught, but developed, one of these so-called epidemic diseases, how should the child be cared for? Should you have it inoculated? Should it be drugged? Should its tonsils be removed? What should you do for it? Caring for that child is simplicity itself. In the first place, the disease itself is a remedial process. It's not something that needs to be killed or cured or subdued or subverted or suppressed or thwarted. It is something that should be permitted to complete its purification work. You do not treat the disease. You care for a child. You do not treat a heart. You care for a patient. It's the individual you have to care for. And only by improving the physiological status of an individual as a whole can you expect to improve the condition of any particular part or organ of that individual. So, caring for this child, it's got fever, it's got a fast pulse, it's got a coated tongue, it's got a foul breath, may have a distress, it may have swelling in the stomach, it may have an eruption or whatnot. All you have to do with that child is put it in bed, give it nothing but water and plenty of fresh air, put it in a well-lighted room, give it all the fresh air it wants, nothing but water should pass its lips, keep it warm, let it rest, and keep all the scaremongers of the neighborhood out of the room. Don't quarantine the child, quarantine the neighbors. The chief function of a doctor at the bedside of a patient should be to wield a heavy club. Not to club his patient, that's what the medical man does. But to club busybodies out of the sick room. They like to come in and visit. Talk and talk and talk, far into the night. Oh, now Mr. Jones's little boy, he had measles, and he suffered, and he died. What do you think of the effect on the child, the sick child lying there listening to that kind of talk? Or it may be an adult. Some of the neighbors are telling about how Mr. Jones had appendicitis, and how he suffered, and how he was operated on, and how he died. And imagine the effect on the patient lying there listening to that stuff. Besides the noise, there's the fear. Then to keep the lights burning. I'm worried because the patient can't sleep. Perhaps smoking in the sick room. You go into the hospitals and you'll see smoking all through the hospitals. Visitors smoking, even the patients smoking. And down in the halls you'll find these vending machines where you drop in a nickel in the slot and take out a Coca-Cola. The nurses run every once in a while and get some bottles of Coca-Cola for their patients. Well, that's all right in a medical institution because they have cures. They don't have to remove causes. But all you have to do is to give your child an opportunity to recover, and it'll do so. In other words, if you don't kill the child with treatment, its own unaided efforts will restore it to health within a few hours to a few days, without complications and without sequel. Thank you.
We have something extra special scheduled for tonight, which wasn't listed on the program. If it isn't a success, I'm to blame for it. One of our New York hygienists wrote me that there is a movie called Blood of the Beasts. So without consulting Dr. Curcio, who is in charge of the program, I took it upon my own to say, okay, send it. The film, wait a minute, wait till you hear the rest. The film has arrived. As soon as I got to Miami, I told Dr. Curcio what I had done. And he said, oh no, you can't show that film. So I said, what's the matter? This hygienist said it will be one of the highlights of the show.